The morning light hadn't yet touched the rose garden when the Secret Service agent noticed something unusual. It was March 1983, and Agent Michael Deaver had been on the dawn shift for 3 months. But this was the first time he'd seen the Oval. Office lights on at 4:47 a.m., not the overhead lights, just the single brass lamp on the Resolute desk, casting a golden pool in the pre-dawn darkness. Through the bulletproof glass, he could make out a silhouette. The president was already there, but not sitting at his desk. He was on his knees beside it. Deaver would later tell his wife that what struck him wasn't just the image of the most powerful man in the world kneeling in solitude. It was the absolute stillness of it. No movement, no sound that could penetrate the reinforced walls. Just a man and whatever conversation he was having with the darkness. This scene, unknown to the public and unreported by the press, would repeat itself before every major decision of Reagan's presidency. But it would take a bitter confrontation with his own chief of staff to reveal why. James Baker III was a practical man. A Texas lawyer who believed in briefing books, not prayer books. He respected Reagan's faith the way one respects a family. Heirloom, acknowledgement without engagement. But on this particular Tuesday in November 1985, with the Geneva summit approaching and nuclear war hanging in the balance, Baker's patience had worn thin. "Mr. President," Baker said, standing in the doorway of the Oval Office at 5:15 a.m., finding Reagan once again in that familiar position beside his desk. "We have 17 position papers to review before your breakfast with Schultz. This ritual of yours is eating into critical preparation time." Reagan rose slowly, his knees protesting after 20 minutes on the hard floor. He turned to face his chief of staff, and Baker was surprised to see not anger, but something that looked almost like pity. "Jim," Reagan said quietly, "sit down." "Sir, we really don't have." "Sit down, Jim. The world can wait 5 more minutes." Baker sat, his legal pad balanced on his knee, pen poised for whatever instruction was coming. But Reagan didn't move to his desk. Instead, he walked to the window, looking out at the still dark lawn where sprinklers were painting silver arcs in the security lights. "Do you know what this room does to a man, Jim?" Reagan asked, his reflection ghostlike in the window. "It whispers to you. Every president hears it. Some hear destiny, some hear history, but mostly it whispers about power." Baker shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the Reagan he knew from cabinet meetings, the cheerful storyteller, the eternal optimist. This was something deeper, more raw. "My first night here," Reagan continued, "I couldn't sleep. Nancy had already dozed off, but I kept thinking about the briefcase. You know the one. The codes, the power to end civilization with a phone call. And I realized something that terrified me." He turned from the window, and Baker saw something in the president's eyes he'd never noticed before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of terrible awareness. "I realize that everyone who enters this office thinks they're strong enough to carry that weight alone. Every single one. And every single one is wrong." "Mr. President," Baker began, but Reagan held up a hand. "Let me tell you about my father, Jim, Jack Reagan. You've heard the stories. Alcoholic, traveling shoe salesman, died young. All true, but there's one story I've never told publicly, never even told Nancy the whole truth of it." Reagan moved to one of the 2 chairs facing the fireplace, gesturing for Baker to take the other. The formal distance of desk and visitor's chair was gone. This was just 2 men in the early morning darkness. "I was 11 years old," Reagan said, his voice taking on that storytelling cadence, but slower, more careful. "It was February bitter. Cold in Dixon. I came home from school to find my father passed out in the snow on our front porch. Not unusual, except this time he was bleeding. He'd fallen, cut his head on the ice. The blood had frozen in his hair." Baker set down his legal pad. The pen rolled onto the floor, but neither man moved to retrieve it. I dragged him inside. He was bigger than me, heavier, but somehow I managed. Got him to the sofa, cleaned the wound, put a blanket on him. And then I did something I'd never done before. I knelt beside that sofa and I prayed. Not for him to stop drinking, I'd given up on that. I prayed for something else. Reagan paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the room, beyond the years. I prayed for the strength to forgive him. Every day. Because I'd realized something that an 11-year-old shouldn't have to realize, that hating him was killing. Me faster than the whiskey was killing him. Did it work? Baker asked, surprising himself with the question. Reagan smiled, but it was a complicated expression. Not the way I expected. He didn't stop drinking, but I stopped hating. And years later, when I was older, I understood what really happened that day. I didn't find the strength to forgive him. I found the humility to realize I needed forgiveness too. We all do, every day. Baker was quiet, processing this. Outside, the first hints of dawn were touching the sky. So yes, Reagan continued, I kneel in this office every morning. Not because I think God has office hours, but because power without humility is the most dangerous force on earth. And there's no humility quite like being on your knees in the dark, asking for wisdom you know you don't possess. What do you pray for? Baker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reagan stood, walked to his desk, and picked up a small worn card from beside the phone, the one with the nuclear codes. Next to it was another card, equally worn. He handed the second one to Baker. Written in Reagan's handwriting were the words, Not my will, but yours. Give me wisdom. Give me courage. Give me humility. And if I must be wrong, let me be wrong on the side of mercy. I pray that, Reagan said simply. Every morning, before every decision. Because the moment I think I have all the answers is the moment I become dangerous. Baker stared at the card. The Geneva Summit. Gorbachev is a communist. He represents everything I've fought against my entire political life, Reagan said. Which is exactly why I need to spend time on my knees before I meet him. Because somewhere between my certainty and his, there might be a path to peace. But I'll never find it if I walk into that room thinking I'm the righteous one. The chief of staff was silent for a long moment. Then, may I ask you something, Mr. President? Always. That first morning when you started this ritual, what made you do it? What was the decision you were facing? Reagan's expression grew distant again. Whether to forgive John Hinckley Jr., Baker's breath caught. The assassination attempt was barely 2 months past when Reagan took office. I was still having nightmares, Reagan continued. Still feeling that bullet near my heart. Some nights I'd wake up tasting blood that wasn't there anymore. And I had to sign papers about his prosecution, about security measures, about a dozen things that all boiled down to one question. How much hate was I going to carry? He moved back to the window. Dawn was breaking fully now, painting the Washington Monument in shades of gold, so I knelt. Right there, where you saw me this morning. And I prayed the prayer I'd first prayed beside my father's drunk body. For the strength to forgive. For the humility to remember that I needed forgiveness too. And you know what happened? Baker shook his head. Peace, not happiness, not some mystical experience. Just peace. The kind that lets you sign papers about. The man who tried to kill you without your hand shaking. The kind that lets you sleep without seeing his face. The kind that lets you lead a nation without becoming consumed by your own power. The room was fully lit now, the morning sun streaming through the windows. Baker could hear the White House beginning to wake, distant footsteps, muffled voices, the day's machinery starting to turn. I've misjudged this, Baker said finally. Your prayer time. I thought it was no. A luxury, a personal indulgence. Reagan turned from the window, and now he was smiling, that famous smile, but with depths Baker had never noticed. Jim, in this office, prayer isn't a luxury. It's a survival mechanism. For the president and for the country. Baker stood, bending to retrieve his fallen pen. As he straightened, he found himself asking, "Would you mind if tomorrow morning ... could I join you?" Reagan's eyebrows rose slightly. "It's not a comfortable floor, Jim. I've knelt on harder ground," Baker said, thinking of his own father, his own failures, his own need for something larger than political strategy. 5 a.m., Reagan said. "I'll bring an extra cushion." As Baker turned to leave, Reagan called after him, "Jim? Those 17 position papers for Geneva?" "Yes, Mr. President." "We'll get to them. But first, we'll spend some time remembering that Gorbachev probably has his own 17 papers. And maybe, just maybe, he's got his own version of kneeling too." Baker left the Oval Office a different man than he'd entered. Over the following weeks, the morning ritual expanded. First Baker, then Secretary of State George Shultz, then others. Never mandatory, never public. But somehow word spread in that mysterious way things do in the White House. They didn't all pray. Some just sat in silence. Some meditated. One admiral told Reagan he spent the time thinking about his grandson. But they all came seeking the same thing, a moment of humility before the weight of the day's decisions crashed down upon them. The press never knew. The official schedule always showed Reagan's day beginning at 7 a.m. with security briefings. They never knew about the 5 a.m. gathering, the quiet voices in the pre-dawn darkness, the most powerful people in the world admitting they weren't powerful enough. Years later, after Reagan had left office, after Alzheimer's had begun its cruel theft of his memories, Nancy would find him some mornings kneeling beside their bed in California. He couldn't remember why he was doing it, couldn't remember the words to his prayer, but his body remembered the position. His soul remembered the need. She would kneel beside him, holding his hand, and they would stay there in silence until the confusion passed. And sometimes on the clearest mornings, he would whisper fragments of that old prayer. "Not my will. Give me wisdom. Let me be wrong on the side of mercy." But the most profound impact of Reagan's ritual wouldn't be known until decades later, when the Soviet archives were opened. Among Gorbachev's personal papers, historians found a memo dated just before the Geneva summit. In it, the Soviet leader had written to his wife, Raisa, "The Americans think Reagan is simple. They are wrong. I have learned he rises before dawn to pray. A man who knows he needs guidance from something greater than himself is a man who might actually listen. Perhaps there is hope for peace after all." At Geneva, when Reagan and Gorbachev met for the first time, they were scheduled for 15 minutes. They talked for hours. Later, Gorbachev would tell his advisors that Reagan had begun their private conversation with unexpected words. "Before we speak as leaders, can we speak as men who both know the weight of possibly being wrong?" It was a question born in the pre-dawn darkness of the Oval Office, on knees that knew the hardness of the floor, from a heart that had learned forgiveness beside a drunk father's body and practiced it every morning since. The Cold War didn't end that day. But something shifted. Two men who should have been enemies found they could be, if not friends, at least fellow travelers carrying impossible burdens. And it started with one of them having the humility to kneel. Michael Deaver, the Secret Service agent who first witnessed Reagan's morning ritual, kept the secret for 30 years. But on the day Reagan died, he finally told his son the story. His boy, now an agent himself, asked him what he thought Reagan was praying for all those mornings. Deaver thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't think he was praying for anything. I think he was praying to remember something." "Remember what?" "That the most powerful man in the world is still just a man. And every man needs help carrying what he can't carry alone." In the Oval Office today, the resolute desk sits where it always has. The brass lamp still works. And sometimes, very early in the morning, before the world wakes up and demands answers, a shadow can be seen through the bulletproof glass. Another president, another burden, another recognition that power without humility is the path to darkness. The carpet is newer now, softer on aging knees. But the floor beneath remembers the weight of leaders who knew that the strongest position they could take was the one that brought them closest to the ground. Reagan's prayer card is in the National Archives now, those handwritten words preserved. Behind glass, not my will but yours. Give me wisdom. Give me courage. Give me humility. And if I must be wrong, let me be wrong on the side of mercy. But in the Oval Office, in the pre-dawn darkness, the prayer lives on. Not in the words, but in the posture. Not in the ritual, but in the recognition. That leading a nation requires more than intelligence, more than strategy, more than strength. It requires the humility to kneel, the wisdom to listen, and the courage to admit that the most powerful person in the room is the one who knows they need help. Every morning, before every decision, in the darkness before the dawn, because that's where grace lives, in the space between our knees and the ground, between our certainty and our doubt, between our power and our prayer. And sometimes, if we're very quiet, if we're very still, we can hear what Reagan heard all those mornings in the Oval Office. Not answers, not instructions, not even comfort, just the simple, profound reminder that we are not alone, not in our decisions, not in our doubts, not in our need for something greater than ourselves. The light still comes on at 4:47 a.m. some mornings. The Secret Service agents know not to worry. They know it's just another president learning what Reagan knew, what every leader must eventually learn, that the view from your knees is clearer than the view from the throne, and that the most powerful prayer isn't the one that asks for victory, but the one that asks for wisdom to know when victory isn't the answer. In the end, that may have been Reagan's greatest legacy. Not the policies, not the speeches, not even the way he helped end the Cold War, but the simple, radical act of a powerful man choosing to kneel every morning in the darkness and inviting others to join him in admitting what every human being knows but what leaders sometimes forget. We all need help. We all need forgiveness, and we all need the humility to ask for both, every morning, before every decision, in the place where power meets prayer and finds itself transformed into something greater. Service. The ritual continues. The prayer evolves. But the posture remains the same, because some truths are best learned on your knees, and some strength is only found in admitting weakness. Every morning, in the Oval Office, where the most powerful person in the world remembers how to be human, that's the real power. That's the real prayer. And that's why somewhere in Washington tonight, as the city sleeps and the world turns toward another dawn, a light will come on in the Oval Office. A figure will kneel beside the resolute desk, and for a few moments, the weight of the world will rest not on shoulders, but on something greater. Something that has held the weight since the beginning. Something that whispers to those who kneel, "You were never meant to carry this alone." And in that whisper, in that darkness, in that choice to kneel, a leader is born. Not of power, but of humility. Not of strength, but of surrender. Every morning, before every decision. In the place where prayer begins. On our knees, admitting we need help, just as Reagan did. Just as his father never could. Just as every human being must, if they want to carry weight too great for human hands. The light goes off, the day begins. But the prayer remains, echoing in every decision, every choice, every moment when power could corrupt but humility intervenes. That's Reagan's ritual. That's his legacy. That's the story of the man who ruled the free world from his knees and found that was the only way to truly stand. 3 months after that first morning with Baker, something extraordinary happened. It was February 1986 and the Challenger disaster had just shaken the nation. 7 astronauts, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, were gone in a fireball that played endlessly on every television screen in America. Reagan had to address the nation that evening. His speechwriters had prepared remarks, but as he sat in the Oval Office that afternoon, he pushed the papers aside. Peggy Noonan, his young speechwriter, watched nervously as the president stood and walked to his familiar spot beside the desk. "Mr. President," she said softly, "we don't have much time to revise." "I'm not revising." "Peggy," Reagan said, already beginning to kneel, "I'm listening." She stood there, uncertain, as the most powerful man in the world knelt on the carpet. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows. She could see his lips moving silently, and then, unexpectedly, she heard him speak aloud. "How do I explain this to the children?" he whispered. "They were watching. They saw. Their teacher. How do I explain that sometimes courage leads to tragedy, but we must be courageous anyway?" Peggy found herself kneeling beside him. She wasn't particularly religious, had always been more comfortable with words than prayers. But in that moment, she understood something about leadership that no political science class had taught her. After 10 minutes, Reagan rose. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Peggy, throw out what we have. I need to speak to the children. First, not the nation. The children who watched their teacher die." That night, Reagan delivered one of the most memorable speeches of his presidency. He looked directly into the camera and spoke to the schoolchildren of America. "I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave." But what the nation didn't see was how those words were born, in the space between his knees and the ground, in a prayer that wasn't asking for eloquence, but for understanding of a child's grief. Later, Peggy Noonan would write about that afternoon, though she never mentioned the prayer until after Reagan's death. "I learned that day that great speeches don't come from great writers. They come from leaders who are humble enough to admit they need help understanding the heart of their audience." Reagan didn't kneel to find words, he knelt to find empathy. The morning ritual continued to evolve. By 1987, it had become something of an open secret among the senior staff. They called it the quiet time, and though it was never mandatory, absence was noticed. Not judged, but noticed that one morning, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger arrived. To find Reagan already on his knees, but this time he was holding something, a photograph. As Weinberger approached, he could see it was a picture of Marines. Young faces, serious and proud. "Route," Reagan said simply, not looking up. 241 of them. Gone, Weinberger knew. The 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut haunted Reagan more than any other decision of his presidency. He had sent those boys there. They had died on his watch. "I pray for them every morning," Reagan continued. "Each one. I can't remember all their names anymore, but I remember their number. 241. I ask myself if my pride, my desire to project strength, cost them their lives." "Mr. President," Weinberger began, but Reagan held up the photo. "Do you know what their commander told me after it happened? He said they died doing what they believed in, protecting peace. But Cap, I sent them there. My decision, my responsibility." Weinberger knelt beside his president. He hadn't knelt for anything since his wedding day 40 years ago. But somehow, in that office, with the weight of those young faces between them, it seemed the only appropriate response. "How do you carry it?" Weinberger asked after a moment. Reagan placed the photo carefully on the carpet between them. "I don't. That's the point. I come here every morning to lay it down. To admit I can't carry it alone. Some mornings, that's all I pray. I can't carry this alone, and somehow, by the time I stand up, it's bearable again. Not lighter, never lighter, but bearable." They knelt in silence for several minutes. Then Reagan spoke again, so quietly. Weinberger almost missed it. My father died thinking he was a failure, broken by drink, disappointed by life. But you know what? He taught me the most important lesson any leader can learn. He taught me it's possible to break under the weight of your responsibilities. He taught me that strength isn't about what you can carry, but about knowing when to ask for help. Reagan picked up the photograph, kissed it gently, and placed it in his desk drawer. Later, Weinberger would learn that drawer contained dozens of such photos: soldiers, astronauts, citizens who had died as a result of decisions made in that room. Reagan's private memorial, his daily reminder of the cost of power. As the Iran-Contra scandal began to unfold in late 1986, the morning gatherings took on a different tone. Reagan seemed more burdened, his prayers longer, his silence deeper. One morning, Oliver North himself appeared at the door. "I heard about the morning prayers," North said, standing stiffly in his uniform. "I thought ... I wanted ... Come in." "Oliver," Reagan said simply. North knelt, but his posture was rigid, military. After a moment, Reagan spoke. "Do you know what you've done?" "I protected the country, sir. I did what I thought you wanted." Reagan turned to face him. "No, Oliver. Do you know what you've done to the trust between a president and his people?" North's rigid posture began to crack. I believed I was serving a greater good." "We all believe that," Reagan said sadly. "Every terrible decision in history was made by someone who believed they were serving a greater good. That's why I kneel here every morning, to remember that my definition of greater good might be wrong." For the first time, North's military bearing completely collapsed. He bent forward, his forehead nearly touching the carpet. "I never meant. I thought." "I know," Reagan said, "but thinking isn't enough. Not in this office. Not with this power. We have to do more than think. We have to listen. We have to doubt ourselves. We have to pray that our certainty doesn't blind us to our mistakes." They knelt in silence until North began to weep, great, shaking sobs that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. Reagan placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder, but said nothing. Some confessions couldn't be answered with words. When North finally composed himself and left, Reagan remained on his knees longer than usual. Baker, who had witnessed the exchange, finally spoke. "That was generous of you, Mr. President. Many would have been harsher." Reagan looked up, and Baker was struck by how old he suddenly seemed. "Jim, do you remember what I wrote on that prayer card? If I must be wrong, let me be wrong on the side of mercy. Well, I was wrong. Wrong to trust without verifying. Wrong to create a culture where someone like Oliver thought lying was loyalty. But if I'm going to be wrong, I'd rather be wrong forgiving him than condemning him. Even if it costs you politically." Reagan managed a small smile. "Especially then. The moment I start praying for political protection instead of wisdom is the moment I stop being worthy of this office." As his presidency entered its final years, Reagan's morning ritual became even more precious to him. The Alzheimer's hadn't been diagnosed yet, but those closest to him noticed small changes. He would sometimes forget the beginning of his prayer. By the time he reached the end, he would kneel facing the wrong direction, toward the window instead of the desk. But he never forgot to kneel. One morning in 1988, his last year in office, Nancy found him in the Oval Office at 3 a.m. He was fully dressed, kneeling in his usual spot, but confused. "Honey," she said gently, "it's too early. Come back to bed." "I can't," he said, and there was panic in his voice. "I can't remember the words. The prayer. I've said it every morning for 8 years, and I can't remember the words." Nancy knelt beside him, taking his hands. "Then say what you remember." Reagan closed his eyes, his face strained with concentration. "Help," he finally whispered. "Just ... help." Nancy pulled him close. "That's enough, Ronnie. That's all any of us are really saying anyway. They stayed there until dawn, the President and First Lady, kneeling together in the office where so many decisions had been made, so many prayers offered. And in that simple plea, help, was perhaps the purest prayer Reagan had ever prayed. George H.W. Bush, preparing to take office, asked Reagan about the morning ritual during their transition meeting. "Is it true?" Bush asked. "Every morning?" "Every morning," Reagan confirmed. "Except once." "When?" Reagan's eyes grew distant. "The morning after the assassination attempt. I was in the hospital, couldn't kneel. But you know what? That was the morning I realized something. The prayer isn't in the kneeling, it's in the admitting. You can admit you need help lying in a hospital bed just as easily as kneeling on carpet. Maybe easier." Bush was quiet for a moment. "Will you show me?" "Tomorrow morning?" Reagan smiled. 5 a.m., George. Bring your own cushion. We're both too old for heroics." On Reagan's last morning as president, January 20th, 1989, he arrived at the Oval Office at 4:30 a.m. The secret service agent on duty noted it was the earliest he'd ever seen the president. But this time, Reagan wasn't alone. Bush was already there, along with Baker, Schultz, and a dozen others who had shared those morning moments over the years. They knelt in a circle, these powerful men and women, as the last darkness before Reagan's last dawn as president held the room. No one spoke for a long time. Then Reagan, his voice stronger than it had been in months, began to pray aloud. "Father, I came to this office thinking I had answers. I leave it knowing I barely understood the questions. I came thinking strength was in certainty. I leave knowing it's in humility. I came alone. I leave." His voice broke slightly. "I leave surrounded by friends who learned with me that leadership isn't about standing tall. It's about kneeling together." He paused, then continued. "For my successor, I pray not for success but for wisdom. Not for power but for humility. Not for certainty but for the courage to doubt. And most of all, I pray he finds what I found in this room, that the most powerful position in the world is on our knees." When they rose, the sun was just beginning to paint the Washington Monument. Reagan walked to his desk one last time, opened the drawer, and pulled out the stack of photographs, the Marines, the astronauts, all the faces that had accompanied his prayers. "What will you do with them?" Bush asked. Reagan looked at the photos for a long moment. "Leave them. They belong here. They're part of the office now. Part of the reminder." He placed them back in the drawer, then removed something else. His original prayer card, now so worn the words were barely visible. He handed it to Bush. "This is yours now," Reagan said. "The words might fade, but the need never does." Bush took the card reverently. "I'll be here tomorrow at 5. Reagan smiled. "It gets easier, George. Not the job, that gets harder, but the kneeling gets easier. Eventually you realize it's not a burden, it's a gift. The gift of admitting you're human." As Reagan left the Oval Office for the last time, he turned back at the door. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the spot where he had knelt thousands of times. For just a moment, he could see them all, every prayer, every tear, every admission of need. They shimmered in the light like a congregation of ghosts, all those moments when the most powerful man in the world had chosen to be powerless. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty room. Then he walked out, leaving behind the presidency, but taking with him the most important lesson he had learned, that true power comes not from what we can do alone, but from admitting what we cannot. The tradition continued after Reagan left. Bush knelt there every morning of his presidency. He was later joined by Clinton, who, despite their political differences, understood the weight that room carried. Even those who didn't share Reagan's specific faith found something in that morning silence, a moment of reflection, of humility, of human connection that transcended party or policy. Years later, When Reagan's Alzheimer's had stolen most of his memories, Nancy would sometimes find him trying to kneel beside their bed in California. "What are you doing, honey?" She would ask, "I'm supposed to. There's something I'm supposed to." He would struggle, the words just out of reach. "You're supposed to pray," she would say gently, kneeling beside him. "Yes," he would smile, relieved. "But I can't remember why." "Because you're human, Ronnie, and humans need help." "Do I need help?" he would ask, genuinely curious in the way the disease made him. "We all do, honey. We all do." And they would kneel together, the former president who couldn't remember being president and the woman who remembered for both of them. No words usually. Words had become difficult for him. But the posture remained, the admission, the humility. On June 5, 2004, when Ronald Reagan finally passed away, Nancy made one last request. Before the state funeral, before the pageantry and ceremony, she wanted a moment alone with him in the Capitol Rotunda. The officials agreed, clearing the Great Hall for a private goodbye. But when they opened the doors for her, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a line of people, cabinet members, Secret Service agents, speechwriters, janitors, all the people who had shared those morning prayers over the years. He wouldn't want to be alone, Nancy explained simply. And so, in the great rotunda of the United States Capitol, under the painted gaze of Washington and Lincoln, a most unusual scene unfolded. One by one, these men and women knelt beside Reagan's casket, not in organized ceremony, but in remembered ritual, each spending a moment in the posture he had taught them, the posture of admitted need, of shared humanity, of power surrendered. For something greater. The last to kneel was Michael Deaver, the Secret Service agent who had first seen Reagan praying that morning in 1983. He was retired now, his hair gray, his knees protesting. But he knelt anyway, placing a hand on the flag-draped casket. "Thank you," he whispered, "for showing us that the strongest thing a leader can do is admit weakness. The bravest thing is to ask for help. And the greatest thing is to remember we're all just humans, trying to carry weight too heavy for human hands." When he rose, he noticed something. Each person who had knelt had left something behind, not flowers or mementos, but small cards. Prayer cards, each with their own version of Reagan's morning words. Dozens of them, scattered around the casket like a paper congregation. Nancy gathered them carefully, reading each one. Some were exact copies of Reagan's original prayer. Others were personalized, prayers for wisdom and justice, for strength and service, for humility and power. But all of them ended the same way. "And if I must be wrong, let me be wrong on the side of mercy." That night, alone in her hotel room, Nancy added her own card to the collection. But hers was different. It wasn't a prayer for leadership or wisdom or strength. It was simpler, more personal. "Thank you for teaching us that the most powerful prayers are prayed on our knees. And the most important words are the hardest to say. I need help." Today, in the Reagan Library, there's a display most visitors pass by without noticing. It's a simple brass plaque beside a photo of the Oval Office at dawn. The plaque reads, "Every morning, in this room, a president knelt. No explanation. No elaboration. Just that simple statement of fact, but for those who know, for those who were there, for those who learned that leadership begins on your knees, it's enough, because some lessons don't need many words. Some truths are best learned in silence. Some strength is only found in surrender. Every morning, before every decision, in the place where power becomes prayer, and prayer becomes the power to lead with humility, to serve with doubt, and to remember always that we are never as alone as we think we are, never as strong as we pretend to be, and never more powerful than when we admit we need help. That was Reagan's ritual. That was his gift. That was the secret he discovered on his knees in the Oval Office and carried with him even when his mind could no longer remember why he knelt, only that he must. Because some truths live deeper than memory. Some habits are carved in the soul, and some prayers don't need words at all. Just the willingness to kneel and the wisdom to know that's where real leadership begins.